Hi everyone, I'm Joanna Penn from thecreativepenn.com and today I'm here with Sacha Black. Hi Sacha.
Hi, Joanna. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's great to have you on the show. Just a little introduction. Sacha is a best-selling YA fantasy author and also writes non-fiction for writers, including 13 Steps to Evil and 10 Steps to Hero on creating characters. She's also a blogger, writing coach and developmental editor. So Sacha, just tell us a bit more about you and how you got into writing and publishing.
So I think if I'd been slightly more self-aware, I probably would have started writing slightly younger. But I always read as a kid. I kind of had to change libraries because I literally devoured entire kids sections, and sort of similarly, I wrote stories as well. But I also grew up knowing I had to get a proper job. So, instead of going to university and, I don't know, doing creative writing or whatever, I went and did psychology. And after that, I ended up in a fast track management scheme, so kind of corporate Hell Mare, as I like to call it. And yeah, so I became sort of more and more stifled and I needed an outlet. So I created a pen name, which is where Sacha Black comes from, and I started ranting on a blog. Literally, that's what I was doing. But the blogging community is so wonderful, and I met lots of people, and I discovered flash fiction. That sort of led one thing to another, and I dug out my old sort of notebooks, and my first young adult fantasy book genuinely is a character that I created when I was 9 years old. Um,
Cool.
yeah, so she's been with me for a very long time. And then I started writing up lessons that I'd learned because I wanted a place. I'm basically senile, so I needed somewhere to put these sort of writing craft lectures that I'd learned and lessons. And a few of them, particularly on villains, they didn't go viral, but I saw an awful lot of traffic very quickly. And so I did a bit of investigating. I looked on Amazon. I discovered there was very few books on villains. And so I figured there was a market there. And that is basically history. It just sort of spiraled from there.
No, that's really cool. We're going to come back to the blogging, I think. But I want to so the development from flash fiction into a full YA novel, that's quite a leap, isn't it? Because if people don't know, flash fiction's what, 500 words,
Yeah.
1,000 words. So how did you make that leap then from writing flash and writing kind of non-fiction blog posts to full YA? Because I know that's a leap that a lot of people want to make.
Yeah, it was less a leap, more a snail's crawl to writing the book. So I did a very typical thing of somebody who is afraid to start writing. And for an entire year, I plotted, I looked at visual things, I wrote notes, I changed my plot. And after a year, this was sort of the year that I was pregnant. And when my son was born, I knew I had to be the person that followed their dreams because that's the role model that I wanted to be for him. So I heard about nano and I just sort of said a rude word and just went for it, So I took the notes and decided that I had to start or I was never going to start. And the Nano Remo Challenge, for anybody that doesn't know, is 50,000 words in a month. And I figured it was as good of a challenge with accountability. Sort of, you've got these public sort of forums and word counts, and I didn't look back.
How many words did you do in that nano?
52,000 or 57,000. I threw the entire thing away.
So what did it give you then? What did it give you?
The habit. It gave me the habit of writing, and that was all it took, really. I drove my wife insane because she couldn't stand the tapping for the entire month. She's used to it now, but so after the month, I'd got the habit. It was an itch. I had to keep scratching. I had to keep creating, and the nonfiction blogs just weren't enough anymore. I wanted to do both, so I wrote another entire draft, which I also binned. And excuse me, after that, I changed my process and I decided that I was going to get feedback after every single chapter so that I didn't make plot mistakes going through. I intensively studied the craft. And that third draft, did go to publication. So I think in total I wrote 270,000 words of my first book, which ended up at about 64 or something. So.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, there's a few things there. My first nano, which is how I got started, I did like around 20,000 words, and around 5,000 of that made it into the book. But also I think it's interesting because a lot of us feel like the third novel is where you start to kind of understand things. So you just did it all in one. You did it all in one. Which is hilarious. And the other thing you were saying there, my husband also says, like, when there's the tap tap tapping sound, he's like, oh, that's the sound of my wife. So, which is quite funny. But okay, let's get into the books and give some people some tips. And I do think your psychology stuff obviously comes into the books. So let's talk about villains. Why do all stories need a good villain, even if we're writing a happy rainbows unicorns romance?
Okay, so excuse me, I think it's universally accepted that stories are about change. Whether it's your hero that's changing through a character arc, or if it's the world, a kind of dystopian novel that's crumbling, the story is about change. But another word for change is conflict. And I kind of make it a bit sciencey here, but I think that Darwin was absolutely correct in that it is about survival of the fittest, and that applies to our characters as well. So you only really change, I think, when you are pushed to your absolute limits. That is when you're out of your comfort zone and you have to basically adapt or die, as Darwin would say. And your villain, in whatever guise that may be, is generally the source of that conflict. Obviously, you have different types of villains, whether it be an antagonist or, inner conflict or whatever in a literary novel. But broadly speaking, your villain is the source of that conflict. They put obstacles in the way of your hero, and they force your hero to make do or die decisions. And that is why you need a villain. So it doesn't matter which genre you're in. The thing that they all have in common is that the villains are the source of conflict.
And if we don't have conflict, it's just happy people in happy land, which I think James Scott Bell said that. And it always makes me laugh. It's like, yeah, that's not a story. That's just boring.
Nobody cares. Where's the grit? Where's the drama?
Yeah, where's the conflict, which is exactly right. So how do then we construct a good villain with depth that is not cliche, but it's also good enough? Like I was reading some of my diaries and I found a thing about one of the Bond films. It was, why was this not a good Bond film? I can't remember which one it was. And it was like the villain wasn't good enough. I wasn't scared. There wasn't enough of a threat in a good Bond film. There has to be a big threat. But so how do we construct a good villain with depth?
Okay, so I think the key to a good villain is a villain who is both credible and believable. And there's a few different things and sort of tactics and plot devices that you can use in order to create that credibility and believability. So the most obvious one that I think everybody would know is for your villain as well as your hero to have a very, very solid motive. Everybody, I don't care who you are, even if you are a serial killer, has a reason why they do things. It is psychology 101. It's human nature. Even in horror films like Nightmare on Elm Street, Freddy Krueger even has a reason why he wants revenge. He was locked in a burning building. So that's number one. Number two would be morals and values. So having a moral or a value, even when you're a villain, gives them a valid reason. It justifies their behavior. It justifies their why. So I always think that is sort of the second stage of having a motive. The third one that I would say is for your villain to have something in their past, whether it be a wound or a scar that something emotionally wounding or that's created sort of an emotional scar in their psychology that is driving their behavior, because that's kind of connected into the motive. I've lost count. Possibly number 4 would be villain. You know, there's that really cheesy phrase, even villains have mummies, but it's actually really true. And I think if you give your villain a redeeming quality, or alternatively, if you don't sort of want to give them a redeeming quality, you can give them something to love, that humanizes them, and that sort of humanity makes them more relatable, and that's how you get them to connect with a reader. So just a couple of examples. Even Voldemort, Lord Voldemort from Harry Potter, had his pet snake Nagini. So you know, even your sort of everybody must die type villains have that sort of humanity in them.
And it's really interesting. You brought to mind, when you said even villains have mummies, you brought to mind that we need to talk about Kevin, which I think it would be classed as a literary novel. And, you know, it's about a kid who kills his school, not friends, but people at school. But it's his mother. You know, you really have, you feel empathetic towards him, where he is, I guess he's really the villain and it's her story, but it's one of those complicated things. You have to be able to make your villain empathetic in some way. And another question, do any villains really believe they are the baddies?
Well, no, absolutely not. And that's the reason for having values, is that it makes excuse me, having a value gives them this unfaltering logic to their sort of their crazy, I call it, you know, their sort of reason, their big campaign, their thing that they're trying to destroy or whatever. Having a value in their mind will justify their actions, and there's a great example of that. President Snow from the Hunger Games. He has this sort of rule that he tells Katniss, that I only ever kill for a purpose. That's a value, and that justifies his behavior. He believes what he's doing. He kills, yes, but he only kills for a reason. And that automatically makes you as a reader sort of invest in what they're saying. Sorry.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I just started writing another novel this morning as we talk, which is kind of hilarious. And my baddies, you know, want to take our land back. And it's interesting because borders are this area where everyone thinks they're in the right, you know, whose land is it anyway type of question. And this type of thing always comes up for me. Who is the villain in these type of stories? So and then this kind of plays into the idea of theme. So how do we construct a good villain that also plays into the theme of the story, or how do we even strengthen theme with villains?
So I think that they're I can't think of the word, but it's, you know, like a distraction sometimes, thinking about hero, villain and theme. I think all characters play into theme. I think theme's this weird concept that loads of writers panic about and worry about. Not everybody knows what their theme is when you first start writing. Some people don't know until the final draft. But if you have a character arc and if you have change, I can guarantee you have a theme buried in there somewhere. So I personally like to think about theme in terms of a psychological theory. So I told you it would come into play. So there's somebody called Gestalt. I forget the year, 1950 something or other, and it's a psychological theory that basically says the whole is more than the sum of its parts. Now, I liken that to a novel, and similarly to a spider's web. I think all novels are spider's webs, and I call it something called the web of connectivity. Each thread in a spider's web is its own unique thread. But when you step back and you look at the whole of the threads, it's more than just a series of threads. It's an entire web, or in our case, an entire novel. And that stands for things like plot, twists, characters, subplots, you know, so on and so forth. So how does that connect to villain? If you want to strengthen your theme, I put all of my characters on a continuum. So if you have the full embodiment of your theme, that is your hero. If you want the full embodiment of the sort of antithesis, the opposite of your theme, that is your villain. But to strengthen that, you should look at every single character and how they reflect the theme. So leading on with the Katniss and the Hunger Games example, Katniss embodies the theme of sacrifice. President Snow embodies the theme of sacrificing everybody else for his own good, and that plays out by him obviously sacrificing tributes, these kids who have to go and fight each other, he and so on and so forth. The other characters like Peter and Rue are all variations on sacrifice. Even Haymitch, who's sort of this anti-hero mentor character, he is sort of the reluctant sacrificer, but he comes round in the end, and he sort of gives medicine and things to Katniss during the game. So as well as looking at the villain and as embodying and all of his actions being the anti-side to your theme, look at the other characters too, and how you can reflect theme in their actions, and what question are they answering about the theme? How can they embody different variations, different points on the continuum?
Yeah, it's a really good point, and I think you must. I'm a bit more of a writing into the dark type person, and I mean, I know my Matt Walker series, the theme is borders and maps, and where the lines are between us as people and all that. But it's interesting when you say that, and I start to see how I think maybe we naturally, as we're readers, we construct these things. So if people are listening, going, "Wow, that's quite reductionist." Well, you can do it either way. You can kind of reverse engineer later, or you can, work through a workbook like yours, which we're going to come back to in a minute. So let's talk about heroes, because I actually find villains super easy. Like, I really enjoy writing my bad people, and I very often I just don't struggle at all to find empathy with my villains, but I do struggle with my heroes. I feel that I struggle much more with that, and they're almost me. Generally, they are almost me, my main characters, and so maybe that's why it's a problem. But how do we construct a hero who is not just cardboard cutouts?
So I talk about something called the hero lens, which is essentially the concept that everything your reader experiences should be funneled through your hero. They shouldn't come into contact with anything that isn't relevant to what your hero is directly experiencing. And that kind of is categorized for me into 4 different things. So actions, thoughts, feelings, dialogue. The rest of the story, obviously describing things is really important. You need to locate your reader. You need to put them in time and space. But so what? Your reader doesn't really care. All that does is create a picture in their head. If you want to make your reader care, your reader wants to know, what does your hero feel? What do they think about the fact that it's cold on the train and the train's in disrepair, or whatever? That's a terrible example, but you know what I mean. Excuse me. When you share that inner psyche and that inner viewpoint with the reader, that's what makes your hero relatable, and that's what helps your reader to connect with I nearly said villain, that's because I love villains too. That's what makes them connect with your hero. So let me ask you a question. This is a bit random, and I always use this question. I've said this so many times, but is turquoise more blue or more green?
Blue, absolutely. I just took off my turquoise jumper.
Okay, but I guarantee that half of the people listening to this would have said green. And that's what makes your hero unique. It's not motives or traits. Everybody has a motive. Everybody has a trait. What's unique about your hero and what makes your reader fall in love with your hero is their particular perspective, their sort of your hero's rose-tinted glasses. How does your hero's thoughts, feelings, and actions impact how they view the surroundings? So I kind of draw that down to saying, if you want to imbue that in your story, go think about how your hero's viewpoints affect your sentences at sentence level. So if your hero's angry, you have to use shorter, sharper words. If your hero's depressed, make your sentences longer. They flow, they're more melancholy. So that's one thing. Second thing, layer conflict. really important. To me, there's kind of three different types of conflict. Inner conflict, which is your great example of this, Ned Stark. I don't know if you're a Game of Thrones fan.
Of course.
I'm going to Dubrovnik this year.
No spoilers. No spoilers, I hope.
No. So Ned Stark is completely out of context, a character, and George Martin does this quite a lot with his characters. He pits their values against each other and makes them sort of butt against each other and have to make really difficult decisions. So a difficult decision very early on for Ned Stark is he values loyalty, but he also is very intelligent and has a lot of foresight. His decision is he's been asked to go and help the king. If he goes and helps the king, he's pretty sure he's probably not going to come back. And that creates this inner conflict. Does he go and help the king? Which he should, because he's his friend and wants to. But if he does, he kind of knows it might be his end. So that creates inner conflict. A second layer of conflict is sort of your micro conflict, characters fighting against each other, hero, villain, blah, blah, blah. And then your third layer of conflict is macro, so society, world, war. And obviously they're perhaps very fantasy type examples, but you can layer these levels of conflict, and that helps to create barriers and problems for your hero to fight against. And the very last point is the bravery myth. So I think lots of writers think that the way you get your readers to connect is to make your hero brave. Well, I would beg to differ. I think you make your readers, everybody can be brave, so it just takes a bit of balls. Sorry, I say that, guts, but it's the hero who sacrifices something that really shines. And usually the sacrifice has to be something that's important. The more important the sacrifice, the more valuable and the more engaged your readers become. Especially, typically it's something about themselves that they have to give up or sacrifice, to overcome their inner flaw. So those are probably the three things that I would say are most beneficial for your hero.
Yeah, and it's interesting bringing up Game of Thrones, and as we speak, the final series is not yet out, and which is like, oh my goodness. But I think that, I read the first couple of books and then I went off the books, but the TV series is masterful in conflict. And also I think, as you're saying, with heroes and villains, half the time you don't know who's a hero and who's a villain, and that's clever. That's super, super clever. And all these different layers of conflict also. So yeah, I would say Game of Thrones, even if you don't like fantasy, you can watch Game of Thrones and understand this idea of conflict like on every page. It's just incredible. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about some of your publishing things, because I'm very interested. Obviously I have workbooks for my books. You have these workbook editions for your hero and your villain books. So I wonder, why did you want to do workbooks? Is it worth it for multiple streams of income? Any tips for other people on workbooks?
Okay, so completely honest, why did I do them? Because you do. No, okay, that was one of the reasons. The other reason is because I do actually use them. And KM Whalen has some workbooks too, and I used hers, and I actually really enjoyed them. And I found them more useful sometimes than the textbook. So it was sort of a combination of seeing the value that you'd sort of promoted of having them, and lastly, because it makes good business sense. Now, I actually went and checked what my sales were yesterday because I knew this question was coming. And so I have digital workbooks. So I have ebooks, I have paperbacks, and I also have box sets. So I've digitally box setted the pair, and I will paperback it. It's just slotted into, production schedules. Each one of those is earning me between 6 and 10% on top of every textbook sale. So every 1 in 10 will also buy a workbook, or they'll buy the box set. Now, that might not seem like very much, but when you have sort of 6 or 12 or 20 of these workbooks, all of these little 6%, all of these 10%, suddenly you are making a lot of money. And so the other thing is that it takes the pressure off having to have one book that is this golden egg that earns you all the money. I'm not really interested in, well, no, obviously I am interested in that, but it's a much easier business strategy to have lots and lots of different products. So that was, one of the main reasons for doing it. In terms of tips, there are lots of different ways you can make up a workbook. I generally do summaries of my core textbook chapters that give enough information that they're comprehensive without giving all of the information from the textbook for obvious reasons. And when I am writing the textbook, I actually note down questions at the same time, which is silly because essentially I'm writing 2 books at once. But it also means that when I finish the textbook, it only takes me a day to sort of mock up the workbook. So I would say that is probably the first thing. Write the questions as you go, because the questions should hopefully come to mind. Vellum for formatting. It is hard to get Vellum to leave you spaces. So if you can't get Vellum, then pay somebody to format it, because obviously workbooks, you do need space for people to write their answers. And do digital versions, because I was kind of skeptical of doing them at first, because I thought, oh, well, everybody will want a workbook so they can write the answers in it. But actually, that's not the case. I am earning just as much, if not more, from my digital workbooks than I am from the paperbacks. And I think it's possibly for the same reasons that or how I use my own workbooks from other authors, in that I don't write in them, I preserve them so that I can use them again and again. So having a digital version is essentially the same. You just, instead of having a paperback, you reuse the same ebook. So do digital versions, definitely.
Oh, well, see, I haven't done digital versions of my workbooks because
missing out.
Yeah, because I guess, as you say, you think, oh, no one would, why wouldn't you just get the book? I mean, I include all the questions in the main book, so if people want to kind of write them in their journals or whatever, they can do that. But it's interesting, I have been using an iPad a lot more, using an app called iAnnotate on PDFs. So I wonder, that's another way, isn't it? You could basically open up the workbook in on more of a tablet and kind of fill it in. And a lot of people have styluses now, I guess. So good tip there. That's fantastic. Oh, and what size are you doing? 6x9 or?
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
I use
slightly bigger, so they have more space to write.
Yeah, exactly. So I also wanted to ask you, because you have 2 nonfiction books and the workbook editions, obviously you have 2 novels, you've got a blog, so you're not newbie, you're not just starting out, you know what you're doing, but you're not, someone who's super famous for making 7 figures a year, which, let's face it, I'm not either. So any thoughts for people who are where you are, which is, you know what you're doing, but you feel perhaps that you have somewhere to go at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. I am not writing full time. I definitely have somewhere to go. Now, I love this question because it made me stop and kind of reflect. So technically, I've only been published for 17 months. So I haven't even been published for 2 years. So when I thought about that, I was like, wow, it's been a long 17 months, I can't believe how much I've done. And sort of every day I moan that I haven't done enough. But no, okay, so what are the lessons that I've learned? First of all, everybody's situation is different. I have never come across 2 authors who have got to full time by doing it the same way. So the first one is to find your own way, find your own method. Second lesson I've learned is to get your finances in order. I think it's Elizabeth Gilbert who says you don't want your love for creating to have to pay your bills in kind of the giving you that pressure. So clear off debt, make sure you have a nest egg. That would be number 2. Number 3 would be to negotiate a slow reduction. I've been listening to the 4-Hour Work Week audiobook, and something clicked recently in that lots of people think that their employers aren't very flexible, but actually, have you asked? Have you actually asked? because I bet you they are more flexible than you think they are. So asking and negotiating for flexible working and reducing your hours slowly, I think is really positive. That said, I'm a complete hypocrite because everything that I'd reduced up until now was kind of play money. It was just sort of saving money that I would have saved, and instead I took the time to write. And recently I've taken on a lot of freelance work. I've got a lot more projects going, and I cannot do the hours that I'm doing in my day job if I want to take this seriously. And I stalled and I couldn't reduce my hours anymore. Anyway, I've done it. But sometimes you have to be brave and take the risk. Otherwise, you're going to stay in the same place. And I do not want to stay in the same place. What else? Network. It's invaluable. And don't be afraid to ask. So I have met so many authors who are just so kind and so willing to help. And I was so afraid to talk to anybody, that sort of first London book fair. And everybody's lovely, and the opportunities that come out of networking are ample. So I would say definitely network. In terms of marketing, pay to play, unfortunately. And as much as I find it difficult and grueling to kind of do slow burn ads, I try to do a mixture of sort of daily AMS ads, a few sprinkled with a few BookBub CPM ads, as well as trying to do some spike marketing as well. And I think that gives me quite a good mix and is building kind of both my readership and my sales slowly. And I'm happy with that because it makes it stable. Last one, Jack Canfield, who I read because of you. Thank you. Oh my gosh, it was amazing. I have signed a contract to myself with a leaving date that I publicly tell people a lot because it makes me get accountable for it. So, and I keep it in my wallet. And I think every single time I go to buy a coffee or, I see that note and it reminds me to keep fighting every day. So
that's fantastic. And that book is The Success Principles by Jack Canfield, which I listened to or read over 10 years ago when I was looking at leaving. And I also had the bit of paper in my wallet, which said, well, my bit of paper said, I am creative, I am an author. A long time before I was creative or an author. So these things work. And also I went to 4 days a week. That's what I did also, the dialing down, and we downsized and sold everything. And so all of this stuff is exactly right. And I'm glad you've got a date. So let's circle back to blogging because of course you mentioned a whole load of marketing stuff then, but you didn't mention blogging. And I mean, I'm starting a new blog, a new podcast, so I'm still a massive believer in content marketing, but you also helped me with Instagram, which you also didn't mention. So any thoughts on blogging or Instagram for marketing or brand building?
So my blog is very much for my nonfiction audience. I haven't quite worked out how to do the blogging thing for my fantasy stuff, but actually that's what I'm using Instagram for. My blog has garnered me basically all of my subscribers for my nonfiction. It's how I created an audience, and I feel terrible, but I kind of did it by accident. It was like the least of all of the things I've done. That was the least intentional, but it's a great way because nonfiction is about solving problems, and I blogged my lessons, which were essentially solving fiction writing problems, and I sort of shared them on Pinterest and different social media channels, and that's how I gained a nonfiction audience. On Instagram, I started because, for a really shallow reason. I'm really visual, and the book pictures are so pretty. And I really liked them, and I wanted book pictures of my books to look like that. So that's how it started. But actually, I find Instagram amazing because one of the biggest problems for fiction writers is visibility. But Instagram has this ginormous Bookstagram community, and they're all whale readers. They're all reading like 100 books a year. Who can read 100 books a year? These people do. I'm telling you. This visibility problem is a problem because you don't know how to find them. But on Instagram, all you have to do is go in and sort of search by a hashtag YA fantasy or whatever. And all of a sudden there's 400,000 people who are fantasy readers, and they're all engaged, and Instagram has all of these quirky ways of being able to interact with people in your stories. You can ask questions, you can play bits of music, you can insert polls, and I found that readers are really, really engaged, and I get responses, I get answers, and I have genuinely sold books because of Instagram, because people find the pictures, they find your stories, and they I guess a bit like your podcast, people start to get to know your voice, get to know your style on your stories, and they buy into you. So yeah, I love Instagram.
Well, you definitely helped me get into it, and I love it too now. And it's funny because I feel like it's a much more personal channel. I feel like, you get to share some personal things. And I'm at JF Penn Author. Who are you on Instagram?
I'm at Sacha Black Author, but Sacha with a C rather than two S's.
Yeah, there we go. So I'll put those links in the show notes. And Sacha took some lovely pictures of my books, which I put on my channel and your channel as well, right? So very, very cool. Okay, so we are out of time. So where can people find you and everything you do online?
So my website is www.sachablack.co.uk. So that was Sacha with a C. All my books are on all of the stores. I'm a wide author, and Facebook and Instagram are both at Sacha Black Author. So
fantastic. Thanks so much for your time, Sacha. That was great.
Thank you for having me.